All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining in. So I'm Rabir Singh Gill. I am a family doctor. So this is part 3 of our segment on self-therapy. So we'll talk about another important element, but just to first review our first two. The idea of self-therapy has to do with, in a gentle, daily sort of way, shoring up the rivers, repairing the damage of the flood, deepening it so that it can handle more sort of floods of emotion, and slowly making your life manageable. It becomes the bedrock on which your recovery can be built. And recovery is for everyone. It's for me, it's for you, it's for everyone, whether you have a diagnosed sort of label or not. So the key to self-therapy is connecting to self, connecting to someone else who's healthy, and committing to daily practice, even if it's in a small way. A daily practice is what slowly heals the wounds and creates capacity, and you'll find that evolves in time. So that's the river analogy, and that's helpful. It builds then up to the next way of understanding the self, which is the subconscious garbage can, which we use to understand the problem, right? The idea that there's a space inside our mind, conceptually, that is storing pent-up emotions and things that don't belong but aren't resolved yet. So facts don't have an emotion attached to them, or they don't have a charge attached to them. If someone passed away, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be disturbing. If it is disturbing, there's likely an element that's stored inappropriately in the circuits, which we know from trauma processing, with the amygdala and hippocampus and all of that. So the storage of excess emotion creates powder keg, or an explosive, I call it plastic explosive, inside the mind, creating a very, very ripe environment for sparks or triggers, like this red one here, to just sort of set it off and flood the mind on an ongoing basis with extra stuff, because a lot of people try to deal with their issues by trying to get rid of the trigger, getting rid of the spark. But life is sparks. Life has that all the time, little bits, little bits, little bits. Sometimes big, sometimes small, but the constant is always that there's sparking. So you can't get rid of the sparks. You can't continuously all the time be putting out fires. That's just painful, to always be putting out emotional fires, of being overwhelmed. And when people are in that situation, they're likely getting into stronger and stronger ways to distract themselves, getting into addiction or other self-defeating habits. And so we can put out fires occasionally, once in a while, but what really needs to happen is for the fuel to be taken away. And so that's what we kind of do when we start targeting these emotional things in the past and start processing them through our self-therapy practice, little bit by little bit, because you don't want to onslaught of all of this stuff all at once. That's overwhelming. Blows up. Have a nervous breakdown, which we don't want. So instead, we take little bits every day. Connect to self, connect to other, commit to daily practice, and a little bit more comes off. You feel a little bit lighter. Sometimes you have more intensive experiences, like going to a yoga retreat and working on some stuff, or going to a therapist and working on some stuff, or periods in your life when you're more committed. The more you do, the faster this goes. But the constant is the self-therapy practice. Nothing gets better. There's a saying that time heals all wounds. Actually, time by itself creates scars. Time plus adequate attention heals wounds. Adequate attention at the time of a loss keeps that from becoming a painful memory. And so a daily, regular practice. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into how does the daily practice work? What are some of the mechanics of it? And I think in order to understand that better, we have to go into another analogy. And I'll call this one the survival mind versus the higher mind. So I'm just going to draw another schematic understanding of the brain. This one will look more like the brain, but it's important to understand that there's anatomical structure attached to each of these aspects, which I'm not going to get into today, perhaps another time. So we're doing more of a general understanding of how the brain works. So this analogy starts with, so we'll call it the survival mind versus higher mind. Okay, so first let's just draw the brain. Let's just, get that out sort of understood here. So we'll draw it here. The brain generally will look like this. Okay, this is the higher mind, and in it we're going to have a different color. We'll call it a bit of a red thing. So the higher mind, so we'll call this HM. It's also known as the frontal cortex. It's the thing that us humans have that animals have very little of. And it's thanks to this that we're actually still here. So the second aspect is the survival mind. We'll call it SM. And we'll also just kind of give it another name, which is the midbrain and brainstem. So the higher mind, or the frontal cortex, the midbrain, or the survival mind, are two parts of a very intricate partnership. And so as long as both of these things are working well, things go well. So what's the jobs here? To be entirely sort of frank, the job of the higher mind is HM, long-term thinking. So the higher mind looks after things that are maybe days, weeks, months, years, decades even. Oh wait, some people's higher minds work really, really well, and they can think thousands of years away, such as the Egyptians, who thought to use sandstone for the Great Pyramids, and Great Pyramids are still here today, thousands of years later. So the higher mind is the long-term thinking aspect. The survival mind is short-term. Survival mind is short-term thinking, meaning it's thinking seconds, minutes, and hours, because that's what it does. That's all that's important. If you're thinking of survival, it's just the minutes and hours ahead. We also call it the reptile mind because it is that old. It's very primitive. Billions of years old. The higher mind works in partnership with the survival mind. There's a boss, and that is the higher mind. But any long-term thinker knows there's no long-term thinking unless you are actually alive in that moment. So the higher mind can't ignore the survival mind when its needs aren't met. So the higher mind basically figures out what's the highest good for everyone, what works out for everyone, and finds that solution that satisfies the short-term and long-term needs of the organism. And as a result of that, we're still here and the saber-toothed tiger is not. So that is the human advantage, is a robust frontal cortex that has a lot of brain mass and allows us to think of problems and solutions in a more advanced way. So in an ideal scenario, the nature of the communication is higher mind is in control. With a little bit of feedback. Actually, we'll just do that in green. Because when you're getting hungry each day, the hunger helps you, right? It's not severe hunger. It's not sort of incapacitating. When you're hungry, your survival mind sends a gentle signal to your higher mind. Hey, I think this is important. And the higher mind's like, okay, that's good. Good to know. Got a couple of hours yet. I'm going to figure this out before the survival mind gets really hungry. And so it figures it out. I'm going to get lunch over there. Now, what would happen if the higher mind ignored the survival mind's needs for a long period of time? Well, then that hunger would become very, very strong, not ignorable. If you go long enough, if you go 3-4 days without food, you might go and want to steal someone's lunch, right? You might want to go do that illegal activity because your higher mind knows that, doing illegal activity is not good for relationships in the long term, not good for long-term survival, but the survival mind knows that without that, it's not going to work. And the longer this part has unmet needs, the harder and harder to ignore that it is. And so a wise higher mind will always think ahead. It'll keep from getting hungry. It'll keep, from unsafe situations that would threaten survival in self or loved ones. So it would understand the priorities of its chief employee in crystal clear language. And what are those priorities? SM priorities. Priorities are really simple. Really simple. number one at the top is breathing. If you're not breathing, doesn't matter what elaborate plans you got. Number two is when you are needing to drink, so water. Number three is food. Number four is pooping and peeing. Which you may remember from a time when you went and watched a movie and the movie wouldn't end. It was too long and you'd had a nice big drink and you really had to go to the washroom. And the longer that movie went on, I remember, because Lord of the Rings, I'll never forget it. The last movie just wouldn't end. And the longer it went on, the less I could focus on the movie, the more I was focused on the need to pee, because I had drank a large drink. So the urgency of these things relates to the how deprived that need is. And there's sleep, right? 6, we'll say there's kind of let's just call it social needs. That need to be met. And in that I would include sexual needs, social needs, emotional needs that need to be met. So when these 6 things are met, this is the situation where higher mind is in control, survival mind is only in an information-giving capacity. Doesn't take over, just gently makes itself known, and then the higher mind takes that and creates the optimal environment so that both can have their needs met. So it's important to understand then what happens when, on the previous page we had that red bomb, that trigger. What happens that all of a sudden that trigger can land in the mind and trigger stuff. And in order to understand that, we need to understand what happens when there is a threat. So when there's a threat to self or loved one, now it's important to understand threat doesn't necessarily mean real or perceived. It actually doesn't matter. Real or perceived, i.e., you think there's a threat, but there's not really a threat. It's going to activate the threat response system. So we call that the limbic system. And what this does, when the limbic system is activated, there's a theory called polyvagal theory. So your sympathetics, your fight or flight or freeze response is activated. A temporary reversal of the situation arises. And so you get this situation. And there's a very good reason for this reversal that I'm sure you'll agree with. If someone's got their hands on your throat, you want to drop what you're doing, you want to drop all the long-term planning, you want to drop everything. Focus on survival. And so in that situation, the survival mind takes control. And the long-term thinking mind, or the higher mind, is in a advisory capacity. So this is why people kind of say, well, I don't know why I did that. I just lashed out. If you ask a road rage person why they were bashing somebody's car, they'll just say, I don't know. A good way to understand someone's emotional state is see how they do with driving. A lot of people who seem very calm and collected all the time have terrible road rage, because the survival aspect of driving, the stress, the worry of cars going fast, all that, can bring out almost a different personality. And that's this personality, the threat response personality. And I call it survival instinct. So this is not a time for thinking, this is a time for acting. And typically, this doesn't go on for very long. If you have a bear beside you, you either fight, flight, or freeze. And whatever you do is probably going to be done pretty quick. Either you're going to be eaten or you're going to survive. So it's usually seconds, minutes, or hours. And in that time, the threat is resolved one way or the other, and you go back to sort of this you go back to that situation where this is back in control. So that's kind of how the system is optimally shaped to work. And so long as survival instinct's only alive for this period of time, and it resolves a threat, then you get a return to this normalcy. So what happens when this goes on for too long? And since I ran out of space here, I'm going to just flip to a new chart. And I'm going to draw a different scenario. So the brain, the way it works is the more you use it, the more brain mass you get. The less you use it, the smaller it gets. So the more activated this part is, the higher mind, the bigger it gets. The less you use it, the smaller it gets. For example, kids these days, they text so much that the part of their brain cortex is dedicated to moving the thumb is actually bigger than people who don't, because the brain adapts. So we know that from neuroplasticity research. So what happens when the threat response is overactivated? Why would that be? So let me tell you. So let's redraw that map. So I'm going to redraw that. So this is the same thing. So this is your survival mind. Now it's bigger, stronger. And here's a shrunken version of the higher mind. And as a result, in this one, the control now rests more so with the survival mind. With little feedback. So a person, because of overactivity of their survival instincts over time, that part of the brain has become stronger, more influential. The long-term thinking part has become less able to be active. It makes long-term plans, but then it doesn't do it very well. It's preoccupied. Or if it makes plans, it can't get this part of the brain to settle down and listen like it used to be able to. So you get what we call a situation of, we'll call this hypofrontality. That's a big word. And usually this arises when the priorities have been rewritten. So the priorities of the survival mind, usually breathing continues to be number one. Number two typically continues to be water, although if you ask somebody with an addiction, they may disagree, especially if it's with drugs and alcohol, although any addiction will do it. And so typically, between water and food, you get something else. You get what I call the people, places, things used to escape emotional distress. Meaning, the perceived stressors, the plastic explosives in the subconscious mind, the ongoing emotional dysregulation, emotionality, or just the jumpiness, lead people to do things to cope. And coping, there's a term, comfort food. It's a very common term. It's a toxic term, though. It implies that food should be not for sustenance and nurturance, but rather to derive comfort from the dopamine hit that you get when you eat it. So when we use people, places, and things to cope with chronic stressors, what we do is we are growing that part of our brain. And that results in difficulty with long-term planning. It results in favoring short-term planning. It results in chronically being, I'm sure you might have met someone like this, who's chronically in a state of fight or flight or freeze. They're constantly afraid of something that's going to happen, or they're constantly on edge. And so when you get a reprioritization, it leads to just going to write the rest of these out. Feeding, sleep, and number 7 is social. So what it leads to is an ability of needing things to cope with activating or the absence of those things, activating the survival instinct. So if you haven't had your coffee today and you are addicted to coffee, absence of coffee can activate that same process where this part takes over this part, or at least enough so that it inhibits long-term thinking and creates distress. Because you got to remember, you're still this part, right? This is the part that feels kind of secure. This is the part that that kind of, most people want to enjoy in their lives. And when you're occupied with survival or preoccupied, then it just prevents that happiness and contentment from coming in. So very helpful to understand what happens. And the thing is, what can you do when this is out of control like this? And the answer we'll get to in our next segment, which is some of the particulars of self-therapy, because you can restore normalcy from this. You can get that old situation back, right? You can get that back. But if it has gotten this bad, it usually needs a process of self-therapy. And what that is practices and people to support your frontal cortex, to give it the control it needs to get back on this thing. So we've all had situations where we feel better when there's someone around who can help us with a problem. We're social animals that way. We work well with other people, and we feel more secure when other people are around. That's why misery likes company, is because when two miserable people are together, at least they know that they're together and they're in this together, and it helps support that frontal cortex, reduces the loneliness. And so constant self-therapy becomes a way for you to support your frontal cortex and increase its mass again, increase its function, until you sort of slowly grow back what was lost through such a long time of living with this. If you're living with this, this creates a need to cope. And so the one thing that I'll point out, there is a way to freeze this. If the one thing that never really gets derailed is the breathing. Breathing never stops or ceases to take back control of the higher mind to create stillness. And why it does that is that the breathing is the priority number one. It always is, always will be. And so when you can re-control your breathing, you can draw your attention from whatever stuff that you're distracted by in a state of panic and come back to a normalcy. You can restore that balance, get that back, if you know how to regulate your breath. Fasting is here, right? A lot of religions in the world, they fast annually, and they sort of teach that, this is a time to be grateful. Why is that? Well, when you starve yourself of food for some time, it brings you back to the basic needs. And the truth is our basic needs are looked after, the vast majority of us. It's just as hard to see it in that moment of panic. And so we will be talking a lot about how do you use these priorities so that you don't have to use the coping stuff. Because this coping stuff is what keeps depositing that stuff into your subconscious. So in our next segment, that's what we'll talk about. Again, I'm so very pleased that you stuck it out to join me in this. And I'm, if I misspeak or if I make any mistakes, please do forgive me. And I look forward to finishing the 4 series. Thank you.